All right, so welcome everybody to this Impact from Home interview series. My name is Kathy Sorbara. I am the head of engagement at Net Impact Amsterdam. So for those of you who may be new to this Impact from Home series, Net Impact Amsterdam is a membership association based out of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and we're all about providing a platform for young professionals who are hoping to create more impact through their careers. And it's a free membership, and we'll put in the chat box how you can become a member if you aren't already. And ever since everything has kind of been shifting from home, normally we have events in person, but now we're doing this virtual interview series, and it's been a amazing opportunity for us to get to know people in Amsterdam and throughout the Netherlands that we haven't maybe not have a chance to learn about. And yeah, have this kind of intimate discussion, really engaging discussion about what they do and why it's impactful. So today we have with us Nava Hinrichs. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, spot on.
Awesome. So I'm going to take a couple minutes to introduce Nava. She has an incredible background, and I want to make sure that I get everything in before we get this discussion going. So Nava is Director of Executive Education and Capacity Building in Migration at the UNU-MERIT and the Maastricht University Graduate School of Governance. So for over 6 years, she was Managing Director of the Hague Process on Refugees and Migration Foundation in the Netherlands, focused on migration policy and research development. And parallel to her time there, she was also CEO of M Capital. This is a social enterprise and subsidiary of THP that aimed to provide sustainable solutions for the labor market integration of migrants. She's previously worked as a consultant on diversity and inclusion for various companies. She is also a regular guest lecturer on international migration law and refugee law at Maastricht University. He was previously a lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa on human rights, law, and politics. She has worked as a legal advisor for asylum seekers in Egypt who were seeking refugee status from the UNHCR. She also has experience working on rural education curriculum developing in Colombia as well as in the UK. She holds an MA in Human Rights Law Development and Globalization and a BA in European Studies. So all this to say, I'm super grateful that she's here today to talk to us about migration. And today is World Refugee Day, so we thought this was a perfect opportunity to bring this topic to light, and a topic that I know I don't know a lot about, but I'm really keen to learn more, and I hope everybody on here is too. So I thought, well, first of all, welcome, Nava.
Thank you.
And I thought maybe it would be a good idea to start kind of a basics so we're all on the same page, and then maybe we can dig in a bit more in terms of what things like are here in the Netherlands and in the EU, and how people can get more involved in the topic. So maybe you can briefly explain the terminology that we tend to hear around this topic. So we
Mhm.
know we hear a lot about refugees, but there's also various types of forcibly displaced persons. So I've heard
Mhm.
refugees before, also internally displaced persons and asylum seekers. So can you give us a flavor of this terminology and what that all means?
Sure. I think the easiest is to start with what a refugee means,
Mm.
because I've seen it, quite frankly, misused quite a lot, just mostly because of lack of awareness and knowledge of what it actually means. And I think once you understand what the definition of a refugee is in real legal applicable terms, then all the other terms will become very easy to understand.
Mm.
So, strictly speaking, a refugee, the definition of a refugee comes from the UN Convention. And the UN Convention is used internationally. It's kind of old, it's from 1951, but it's the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees. And it defines a refugee quite specifically. Essentially, a refugee is someone who has fled their country of nationality because of a well-founded fear of persecution. So the term well-founded is a direct quote from the convention. We could
Mm.
have a 3-hour conversation about what well-founded means,
Yeah.
but essentially it has to be a serious fear. It can't just be something light. So it has to be a well-founded fear. And note that it doesn't even have to be an actual threat. It can just be the fear of a threat to their life and their freedom. And I'll mention two things about that. The first is that when you talk about what a refugee is, the persecution that they are suffering or fearful of suffering, the persecution has to be enacted by the government, by the state, or an agent of the state. So let's say a police officer, that's also fine. It can't just be persecution by any random person, okay? And the second thing that's worth mentioning is that the persecution that the person is suffering can only be for one of 5 reasons. And those 5 reasons are because of their political opinions, that's the first one, or their nationality, or their race, or their religion, or because they are a member of a particular social group. Like, for example, sexual orientation. So let's say that they're, homosexual in a country that doesn't accept that. So those are actually the only 5 grounds on which someone can be deemed to have persecution by an agent of the state. Of course, there's also they include other things, like if there's known war, like in Syria, for example, you know that there's a war there, you know that people are being persecuted, so that also qualifies. But the actual term refugee really only applies in that way, according to the UN and globally. And if you haven't gone through the process of applying for refugee status and for some official to tell you, yes, you fit this criteria, you're not actually a refugee yet. So that brings me to the next one, the next term that you mentioned, Kathy, which is an asylum seeker. So essentially, an asylum seeker is someone who is seeking asylum or protection in a new country for the reasons I just explained before, but has not yet been given refugee status by the governing authority of that new country. So essentially, if I have fled my home country because of a fear of persecution, and I've come to the Netherlands, once I put in my application for refugee status, basically that interim period between me not having it and me getting refugee status, that's asylum seeking, or that's when I'm an asylum seeker, because I'm seeking asylum, I'm seeking to be a refugee, but I haven't yet been granted that by whichever governing authority or decision maker. So that's those two. I don't know if that so far makes sense. And I believe the third one you mentioned is IDPs, or internally displaced persons. That one's also pretty easy in the sense that they're exactly the same as refugees, that they fear persecution for the reasons I explained. But unlike refugees, IDPs have not actually crossed an international border. So they stay, as the name suggests, internally within the borders of their country. And effectively, they're hoping to get protection from their national government. That's a delivery. Sorry for that background. So that's what the difference between an IDP and a refugee. They haven't yet crossed the border, so they're in danger. They fear for their lives and their freedom, but they stay within their country. And as you can imagine, they're extremely vulnerable because very often they're not under the government that's meant to protect them isn't.
And so when you say that someone needs to apply for this refugee status when they reach their new country, does that mean that the country can set its own rules as to what they would deem a refugee to be, or do they just essentially would then tick the boxes of the UN definition and then would grant them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated, but essentially all countries around the world have to adhere, and they use the definition of that 1951 convention from the UN that I mentioned. That's the basis. On top of that, some regions in the world, like for example, in the African continent, there is another convention, the African Convention on Refugees, and that convention expands the UN. Sorry, they're knocking on my window for a delivery. The African Convention expands the definition of a refugee from the basis of the UN definition. But even in those cases, all these other extra conventions, if you like, they use the UN Convention as the basis. That's the foundation. And other conventions might add a little bit or expand it a little bit. but it's not like a country can just be like, we're going to make up our own rules, and a refugee can only mean, and they, they can't go rogue and make up a whole new definition. No, that's not possible.
Okay.
Of course, some countries, let's say, have different systems for going through refugee or asylum procedures, but the definition pretty much stays that way.
Super interesting. Maybe next you can give us a bit of the scope of the issue. When I was researching this interview, I was kind of hit by a number of statistics on refugees. The one that really struck me, and I had written it down, said every minute 20 people leave everything behind to escape war, persecution, or terror. So can you give us a bit of an idea of how many refugees there currently are, and maybe we can bring it more towards the Netherlands and the EU. So how many people are seeking refugee status in the Netherlands? How many people are the Netherlands actually accepting? Is there a cap?
Yeah, so okay, so let me start by the global. The global number of officially registered refugees currently is almost 18 million. That's 80. So it's like something like 7 world. I will say, by the way, that only is for refugees. The number of IDPs is approximately twice that. So in total, we're talking about, if anyone can do the math, that's, sorry, I'm going to have to just open that. So
go for it.
I'm so sorry, that won't stop otherwise. 1 second.
Okay. And I'm noting the questions that everyone's asking, so thank you. This idea of climate refugees, I think, is a super interesting topic. So I'll definitely ask her that.
My apologies. That's the joy of working from home. So globally, there are a huge number of refugees and internally displaced persons. And those numbers, by the way, just keep increasing. In terms of the Netherlands, I know that the official figure for the number of refugees in the Netherlands currently total, and these numbers are given from the 2019 figures, is just over 100,000. So it's 101,000 and a bit. That's the total number that are here in total. Now, in terms of the number of applicants, last year, so 2019, there were just under 30,000 applicants. And out of those, approximately 6,000 were granted refugee status. So using the terms that now you're familiar with, that means there were almost 30,000 asylum seekers, and about 6,000 of those asylum seekers became refugees with a temporary permit to stay in the Netherlands. So that's approximately, 1 in 5 that were granted refugee status for last year. For this year, if you go to the IND website, the IND is the Immigration and Naturalization Agency of the Netherlands. It's part of the ministry here. They produce a report on a monthly basis and that show the number of applicants. The last report I read was from April. So from January 2020 till April 2020, we had just over 6,000 applicants. So asylum seekers. I don't yet know the number that were granted refugee status. That's something that comes about 6 months or so later. We don't find out the numbers until much later. So that's more or less to give you an idea of the numbers in the Netherlands. And in terms of Europe, in 2018, that's the last figure that I could find with statistics. There were 333,000 refugees in Europe in 2018. So that's 1/3 of a million on the whole continent that were given refugee status. So yeah, that's what the figures look like. So you can do a little bit of math in terms of,
It doesn't seem like very much. When you speak about how many refugees and asylum seekers there are, feels like that the EU in general should be doing more. And I guess, do you know which country is accepting the most, or how this actually compares? Is it like a global problem that we aren't accepting enough refugees? Is it an EU issue? Is it a Netherlands issue?
Well, there's a couple of things at play here. the first thing to bear in mind is that 85% of refugees globally, they actually go to countries in what they call developing countries.
Right.
So 85% of the refugees worldwide are actually not in Europe. They are in developing countries. So that's actually the vast, vast majority. So unlike what the media tends to present, other regions of the world, so Australia, North America, and Europe together barely get 15% of the global number of refugees. So that's actually a tiny amount. The thing about, then there's also something to look about in terms of where they go to. Most refugees tend to go to neighboring countries. They don't actually tend to make the huge leap to another continent. So that's something else to bear in mind. In terms of who takes the most in Europe, in the European context, the number one country is Germany, followed by Italy at the moment, and the third country is France. So that's the ones that take the most. What I find an interesting exercise to do is to look at percentages, and not because obviously every country has a different size, right? If you look at the whole European continent, the population is 741 million, I believe, and I quoted the figure in 2018 was a third of a million. So if you do the math, I believe it's something like 0.5% of the population of Europe are refugees. 0.5%. So it's actually really tiny. And if you look at the figures for the Dutch population, it's also something around 0.5, 0.6%, something like that. So it's actually a really, really tiny percentage of the entire population. And as I said, the vast majority of refugees are not in Europe, contrary to what we see in the media. In terms of, is it a European issue? Are we doing enough or not? Well, what I can tell you as a matter of comparison is a country like Jordan, for example. I quoted the figure that in Europe it's 0.6% or so of the population, Netherlands 0.5, something like that. In a country like Jordan, it's around 8% of the population are refugees. So, I mean, 8 is still, one could argue, it's relatively small. There's 92% that aren't refugees. There's different ways of discussing this, but if you look at it comparatively, countries like Lebanon and Jordan are taking on a huge amount more when you compare them to European countries. And that's, by the way, a country like Jordan that has already a lot of challenges when it comes to, for example, access to water. They really, really struggle with that. And on top of that, they have this added burden of having such a huge population of refugees. So yeah, the numbers speak for themselves as far as I'm concerned in terms of what else could we do.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I could continue to ask questions, but I know there's a lot already in the chat box, so I'm going to go there. One question is, what happens when asylum seekers are rejected from refugee status? Are they expected to go back to their home country?
Yes, that's right. So when their asylum seeker application is rejected, they have to go back to their home country, or they have to essentially leave the country where they sought asylum. In the case of the Netherlands, they have 28 days to leave. And unless they're minors. If they're minors, they can stay until they become adults, and then they have to leave. So yeah, it's pretty definitive. They have to leave. They do get some support to leave if they don't have the means themselves to be able to leave. But yeah, that's basically the
And yeah, I really like this question from Thibault. When we think about refugees, asylum seekers, we mostly think fleeing because of war, that type of persecution. He mentions the term climate refugees. Is this becoming more evident? Can we call these people refugees? What kind of status do they have in this context?
Well, the term, strictly speaking, is incorrect. There is no, I mean, I shared with you the definition of what a refugee is. So strictly speaking, they're not refugees, no. The term has been used a lot, mostly by people who don't really understand what the term refugee actually means. We also tend to use the word refuge. I'm seeking refuge. So then they think, well, might as well just say a refugee. Someone who seeks refuge is a refugee. But it's actually not, strictly speaking, the case. Unfortunately, at the moment, under international migration law, there isn't a way to give refugee status to somebody on the basis of climate issues. That being said, there's a lot of debate on this subject. Some people are saying, well, maybe the 1951 convention is outdated and it needs to be updated to include climate issues.
Mm-hmm.
Other people say, yeah, but if you include climate issues, then where are you going to draw the line? It's going to be endless. Other people say, well, how about instead of trying to give protection to refugees for climate issues, we address the climate issues. So there's a whole bunch of different ideas and thoughts on this. What I will say is that what we haven't seen, or what the research shows, and by the way, Professor Hein de Haas has done a lot on this, he's at the UVA, people don't tend to flee their country only because of one reason, unless it's an acute reason. Normally, when it comes to climate issues, it's a sort of an accumulation of things that lead to them having to leave. So, for example, if there's a drought, they might, try to stick it out for another season. If that drought continues, they might have to move to another region of the country. If they have added persecution in that other region, that might eventually lead to economic issues because they can't make a livelihood. So it kind of has a bit of a domino effect that eventually makes them leave. There are some rare cases where, like, for example, the water level in certain islands in the South Pacific have meant that people have had to relocate. Again, those have come on more or less gradually. It hasn't been so acute, but yeah, coming back to your question, technically speaking, no, they are not given refugee status because they don't fall under the convention definition.
Super interesting. And going a bit backwards to the process of getting refugee status, there's a question about two parts. How long does it normally take to get a verdict? Maybe you can speak to the Dutch situation. And Christine asked, how many do end up leaving after being denied asylum? I assume everybody has to leave, but are there a group of people who try and stay? I guess
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine what would be worse for them, going back to a country where they would be killed, or just trying to seek cover even though they didn't obtain the status that they wanted.
Yeah. So in terms of how long it takes in the Dutch context, it varies. It also depends on how many people are coming in and how many asylum seekers are submitting applications. The last I read a few months ago, the complicated cases were taking about 42 weeks.
Wow.
But the sort of, let's say, more standard cases, if they come from a country where, for example, in the Syrian case, it tends to go faster because it's a known, let's say, reality right now. But it can really vary. There's no set, they don't tell you this will take up to a maximum of. So they don't commit to that in terms of giving an answer. I would say it can take anywhere from around 2 to 6 months, but very often longer than 6 months. And as I say, for very complicated cases, up to about 42 weeks, which is almost a year.
And can they do something during this period? Can they work? Are they provided with somewhere to stay?
They are. So basically, there's an agency called the COA, and COA basically gives them a sort of a temporary center where they can stay whilst they process their application. And they're given support. They're given a medical checkup. If necessary, they're given access to a lawyer free of charge. But until they get refugee status, they're not allowed to work in the Netherlands unless the application of their refugee status, the answer basically, takes longer than 6 months. So if it takes longer than 6 months, they are allowed to work up to, I believe it's 24 weeks of the year. So it's still not like they can just go on and work full time. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of issues there in trying to make that a reality. But yes, they do have access to, they have some subsistence. They have a roof over their heads. You might have heard of the asylum seeker centers, the homes that are assigned to them. So they do have some sort of, let's say, a space to be at least to be safe for the most part.
Mhm.
Your other question was, I'm so sorry, I think I've forgotten because I went off track.
I went off track as well. It was if they do get denied,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
you
So
know,
what
we assume
happens?
you have to go back home, but of course that's
Yeah.
not really an option for them.
Well, it's worth mentioning that there are some people that arrive seeking refugee status that actually don't, they're not genuine refugees.
Mm.
We have also economic migrants that want to pass as refugees because, of course, then they get protection in many ways, but they're not genuine refugees. So if that's the case, well, there are some that fall under that category. If, however, they they feel that they have a legitimate claim and they're still not given refugee status, then technically, yes, they have to leave. Um, some, of course, choose not to, and they then go underground. They stay either in the country or they move around Europe, but then essentially they're here not only illegally because they don't have status, but then they're undocumented as well because they don't have any documentation for anything. And as you can imagine, that leads to a lot of different challenges at many, many different levels.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, technically speaking, they have to leave. I
Mhm.
don't have the numbers of how many decide to go underground because it's such a challenge to. I mean,
Sure.
as I say,
Mhm.
they go underground, right? So they're undocumented and they don't have any. So
Mhm.
they kind of fall under the radar. There's estimates and guesses, but yeah, I think
Mhm.
those are difficult to pin down.
Yeah, super interesting. I wanted to bring this topic now kind of into the context of business. So many of our members, you know, they're trying to make an impact in their careers and in their place of business. So what do you think, you know, what do you think the role of the business sector is in this, or what should be its role? How can people kind of help from within their companies?
There's so many different ways. So one is, let's say, at the policy levels, right? So you can talk to the government, you can talk to the Ministry of Justice and Security, or sorry, Security and Justice it's called. You can talk to civil servants there, to the Directorate of Migration. You can talk to local governing authorities and municipalities. You can form coalitions with other businesses to try and put pressure on the government to have changes in laws. You can also join European and international fora, whether it's with the UN or otherwise. The UN actually has mechanisms specifically targeted at the private sector to try and get the private sector more engaged on this subject. So it's
Mm.
something which anyone from the private sector can come on board with
Mhm.
and voice their views, their opinions, their concerns, and what they think should happen. Then at the more sort of micro level, within companies, this is from my personal experience and a bit of research as well. One of the things that refugees and asylum seekers want the most, the moment they arrive and they have their status, is access to work. For the most part, they want to be able to contribute to their host societies. They also want to be able to make a living and be independent. And of course, they also want to be able to send remittances back home from their own hard work. They want to be able to develop their skills, their language skills, their soft skills. They're just unfortunately not given the same opportunities as other people are.
Mhm.
There's a lot of discrimination, a lot of stereotyping, and it's just often very difficult for them to be able to have an in. So if you are working in a company, I think that the most you can do is to take a refugee either as a member of your paid staff, or if that's not possible, as an intern, as a volunteer, and to have the patience to understand that they come from a very different context, and not to victimize them, but just to understand that the context, the labor market from which they are coming from, is very different to the Dutch context. So it will take extra time and patience to sort of get them to acclimatize to the new Dutch reality.
Mhm.
So there cannot be this expectation that they're going to be, from the get-go, be, just like any other Dutch person working in your company. But if you
Mhm.
have that patience and you have that vision to know that it's a small upfront investment, but with very big returns later on, I think that's a wonderful thing that companies in the private sector could do.
Mhm.
As I say, either paid work or voluntary work, or even a buddy system where a refugee can sort of shadow someone for some time to just understand more on how the sector works here in the Netherlands.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, we talk so much within this group about sustainability, and you know, there is the environmental side, but there's also the social side. And if there's going to be an increase in the number of refugees year on year, it makes economic, social, sustainable development sense to integrate them as best we can into, yeah,
Yeah,
into the country. So
exactly. And
really
and
good
you
point.
know, the countries which have adopted that mentality of, okay, they're here, might as well get them to work as soon as possible. Those are the countries where you have far more success stories, in the sense of refugees being able to integrate faster,
Mm-hmm.
having more higher levels of just satisfaction in general. They're learning the language faster. So the faster you can have that purpose and feel like you're contributing something to your society,
Mm-hmm.
that has such a wide ripple effect. So yeah, I think that mentality of, they're here, let's make the most of it, and let's see how we can make this work for everybody. That I think would be the healthiest outlook for anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned before that there can be this kind of negative connotation when it comes to refugees, and it sounds like there needs to be this kind of behavioral shift about how we approach them and how we integrate them into society. So I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but how do you feel we can make this behavioral shift within our society or within our companies so we start
Mhm.
looking at them in a different light?
With one word, is exposure. Really, just
Mhm.
exposure. Anybody who has a fear or some kind of misunderstanding, or a stereotype of somebody else, or of another culture or a sector or whatever, it's not usually out of malice. It's usually out of ignorance. And even if there is malice, that malice is again rooted in ignorance.
Mhm.
Um, so I would say that the behavioral shift will come with having exposure to refugees, and associating, socializing with them with real curiosity, um, to really try to understand them and learn from them, and to try to slowly also share what it means to live in the Netherlands.
Mhm.
Of course, they have to integrate. Of course, the faster they learn the Dutch language, the better. But if you put yourself in that situation, if you go somewhere new and someone is bashing you for having to do things their way, it's going to be harder for you to integrate than if they are open and really curious about who you are, where you're from, and then you'll want to integrate. You'll want to learn their ways and adapt, and to find a way where you can express yourself, as well as being able to um, fit in, let's say, in your new society.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think exposure is the best way. Talk with refugees, socialize with them, go to places where you can meet them, take them out for a coffee.
Mhm.
Yeah, invite them to your company. Like I say, for have a buddy system, or yeah, try to go to shift away from the victim outlook to really seeing them as real contributors to your society that can actually bring a lot to the equation.
Yeah, yeah, that's such an excellent point. I think forgetting about the label, I remember reading this excellent article in Time magazine where it was like, this isn't a refugee, this is a doctor. He's an engineer, he's a
Hmm.
teacher. And I think once you put it into that context, it makes it seem like, well, we're all just humans and like, let's
Hmm.
learn about each other. And it's,
Hmm.
yeah, stripping away these labels, I think, would be really important.
Yeah. And to some people, the label of refugee is important, and they want to keep that for many reasons. They don't want people to forget what they've been through.
Mm,
They want, or maybe they want people to know that, yes, they're in their host country now, but they also have another background from another country.
mm-hmm,
Um, of course, for some people, the label also gives them a level of protection, and they also want that. But as you say, many of the other people feel like the label brings about, yeah, discrimination or stereotyping, and they want to move
mm-hmm,
away from that label. So I think it's a case by case situation, but
mm,
yeah, it really is for us, for anybody who hasn't had exposure or socialized with a refugee, just to really socialize.
mm,
It's very simple, even if you don't work in the private sector, just to reach out and then socialize and see what you can learn. Go with an open
mm-hmm,
heart and open mind. Um, there's good people, bad people everywhere in the world. People who have cultures that you think that's strange for me, or that's not what I like, or a culture that you think that's so attractive. I really enjoy that. It has nothing to do with them being a refugee or not. It's just that they are from a different background. And if we go with an attitude of learning, I think it'll make it easier for everybody.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. Another question in the chat box. Are there things that will overturn the status, such as regime changes in the home country that alleviate the need to flee? That's a great
Yes.
question.
Yes, so basically you're given, in the case of the Netherlands, you're given 5 years of a temporary permit to stay for 5 years. If after those 5 years, the situation in your home country hasn't changed and you still need protection, after 5 years, you can apply for permanent Dutch nationality and residency. However, if in those 5 years that you have the temporary residency, let's say the war stopped or whatever threat that you had that you were fleeing from has stopped, then you no longer need protection. So effectively, yes, it's overturned and you can go back. Of course, there's other more extreme cases where, let's say, you're given refugee status, and let's say you commit a crime against humanity, you would also be stripped of your refugee status.
Yeah, I did have one other question. If you can give an example of a just migration practice or a country that can maybe be a model for the Netherlands in terms of the way that they're handling refugee flows. You have any good examples for us? or better?
Yeah, I'm always hesitant about that because what tends to happen is you mention one country, then everybody refers to that country as being the beacon, and no country has it perfectly right. And it also depends on what angle you're looking from. Even when we talk about integration, for example, there's different types of integration. There's political integration, economic integration, social integration, cultural integration. So it really depends on what angle we're talking about. And even if a country might be doing something fantastic that really works well right now, maybe 6 months or 6 years down the line, the circumstances change, and then it's a different reality. So I'm a little bit hesitant to say, this is the country that is doing it the best. Yeah. But I think we can learn certain good practices from different contexts. So, for example, in the case of Sweden, they are known for giving asylum seekers the chance to work very early on. And what that does is that they start learning the language much quicker. And because they learn the language much quicker, it means that they can also, have work. And so that basically helps them integrate much faster. So it means that the refugees are less frustrated, more integrated. They can make friends quicker. So the ripple effect of that goes very far. Mm-hmm. So as far as that's concerned, I would say that Sweden is a good example for that. There's been a lot of debate about the point system for Canada, for example. But of course, in more recent times, there's been a debate about whether or not that actually is a good system. So yeah, I think there's good examples in many places. Yeah, and of course, in the Mediterranean, we see that a lot of countries have had to deal with a huge influx of asylum seekers that come via the ocean, the seas, and that causes a lot of challenges for the authorities there. And in the early years, it was a scramble to know how to deal with this. But over time, we've come to see that there's been more and more support there. Again, it's not perfect. There's a lot that can be improved. But at least the EU now has this, I think they called it the burden sharing. I like to call it responsibility sharing. So that's what it's called now, I think. But earlier it was called a burden sharing. So yeah, there's shifts being made, and we see that in time. Yeah.
Interesting. And just a couple more questions, and now we're getting towards the time. So what has happened during coronavirus with refugee flows? Have countries still been accepting refugees? Have applications been stalled?
To be honest, this is something that I'm still also curious about. Of course, when borders were closed, then that means it was closed for everybody. And it is causing a lot of issues for people who have genuine refugee claims or genuine asylum claims. It's still a little bit too early to know exactly the repercussions of that. So we're keeping a close eye on that. We've now started to see that more and more people are wanting to do research on this to see how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting migration flows. It's a little bit too early to say for sure. But as you can imagine, it has effects on people that, for example, have stopped. Let's say that you're a migrant or a refugee in the Netherlands and you normally are working here, and normally you send remittances back to your home country. If you've stopped working and you don't have that money, you can't send the remittances back, then that's going to have a knock-on effect, which we have yet to see how far-reaching that will be. It also means, like I say, that people that have genuine fears of persecution can't cross the border, perhaps. I recently spoke to a refugee in the Netherlands. She is Syrian. And I asked her about how COVID-19 is affecting people in Syria. And she said, well, yes, COVID-19 has also reached Syria. But in her experience, from what she observed, it's sort of like the least of the worries for people. Because everything else, the war, everything is still carrying on. So for them, it's just like, yeah, just put it on the pile of worries, but it's not even the most important one. So I think we have yet to see exactly what the repercussions will be on migration flows.
Interesting. Yeah, and maybe to close, there's one interesting question in the chat box. She wanted to know more about educational initiatives for refugees from all age groups in the Netherlands or in an international context, if you know of anything.
You mean for providing education for refugees or education on refugee status and refugee issues?
For refugees, so
for refugees.
To provide them with education.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in the Netherlands, there are a couple of organizations that provide this and that help with this. One of them is Vluchtelingenwerk. So the Dutch Refugee Council, I believe it is in the English translation, and they do a lot there. They do a lot of trainings. They have buddy systems, language courses, and things like that. And they're also able to sort of link refugees with other sources of training and education. So it's a really good, how do you say, focal place for refugees to go, and if they want to find out more about what they have access to and what they can, where they can learn more. There's also the UAF, and they also help with refugees who are looking for work or to further their skills. That's another one. And as I said, the COA also helps to direct refugees into areas of further integration in the Netherlands, including education facilities and education programs. But there's quite a few, I must say, there's a lot of NGOs as well and civil society organizations that do this, but I would say that the main ones to look into, even just as portals for the rest, would be Vluchtelingenwerk. That would be my first port.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. This has been super educational for me, and I've learned so much in a very short period of time. So thank you so much, Nava, for your time. And yeah, please everyone join me in thanking her as well. And if you haven't already, please consider joining Impact Amsterdam. We will have more of these Impact from Home sessions as long as we are mostly gathering at home these days. And we would love to see you back again. So thank you again, Nava. And
thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Everybody. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Bye.